Hello, everyone, and welcome to Climate Australia. My name is Lee Constable, and I want to start by acknowledging that I am broadcasting to you wherever you are from the land of the Turrbal and Yugara people. So I want to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and also acknowledge the ongoing relationship that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in all of the over 250 First Nations of what we now call Australia have with land, sea and sky. So joining me today, I have three guests and our topic is climate communications. So this is climate communications. We're talking about climate and the challenges past and present, but also the opportunities. We're trying to figure out ways of communicating about climate change in Australia today. And we're going to be tackling some of the big questions we have even as climate communicators. So I'll introduce my guests one by one and tell you a little about each of them. This is one of our episodes in our series with the Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. And so I will introduce Alvin Stone. I'll bring him on screen now. Welcome, Alvin. And I'll tell you a little bit about Alvin. Alvin's the media manager at the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes. And he's got quite an impressive bio, which, Alvin, I might just read and put you full screen so everyone can see your smiling face while I read it out. So Alvin works as the media manager for CLEX, which is the abbreviated Climate Extremes name, and has previously been an editor with Australia's largest print media organisations, a media manager with WWF Australia, and a consultant for corporate energy companies. So thank you, Alvin. Great to have you here. And the next guest I will introduce you to by bringing him on screen is Dr. John Cook. Now, John, I'm going to full screen you while I read through your impressive bio. He is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Climate Change Communication Research Hub at Monash University. His research focus is on using critical thinking to build resilience against misinformation. He's the founder of Skeptical Science, which I encourage you all to look up, and also the author of Cranky Uncle vs. Climate Change, which he also produced the Cranky Uncle app, which I'm sure you're all wondering about as well. So welcome to the show, John. Great to have you both here. And now I'll welcome our third guest, last but not least, Professor Ben Newell. Welcome to the show. And let me read you a little bit about Ben's impressive bio. He is Professor of Cognitive Psychology and the Deputy Head of the School of Psychology at UNSW Sydney. Ben's research focuses on the cognitive processes underlying judgment, choice and decision-making, and the application of this knowledge to environmental, medical, financial and forensic contexts, including climate change communication. So there you have it, our four guests. Welcome and great to have you all. This is going to be conversational. We're going to be going back and forth. But Alvin, I might just start with you. Why have you proposed today's topic? I mean, it might be obvious to everyone.
I think it's been really interesting because I've come from a newspaper background, then went to advocacy and then industry and now working with the science. To me, I've kind of seen multiple angles of how science is communicated, and there's quite a disconnect. But the other thing that is particularly striking through that whole period, and really didn't happen until I came to CLEX, was that I wasn't aware as a journalist or even as an earlier advocate of the huge bulk of great research that goes around climate communication. And I think actually it was Ben and John who first put me onto it. Ben, because when I arrived at a former Centre of Excellence I worked at, that he was there working with the director and doing some amazing work on how climate change can be communicated successfully in a way that people understand. And I hadn't been aware of it. And I thought, people need to know about this. And then, of course, when you come into climate science, you have to have seen Skeptical Science. And that in itself was quite interesting. But then as I got to know John and also to kind of see his research work, some of the things that he worked on were really, really impressive in terms of changing people's minds. And I think this is where Ben and John are particularly strong, that the research that they do and others in their field can actually help you change minds and move things. And communication is all about change. And I feel that as practitioners, we don't look at this research enough. And I think that we should. And that's why I'm really glad they're both here today.
Great. That's a great intro. John, just for anyone who's wondering about skeptical science, I was wondering if you could give a bit of an overview of what that is.
Sure. So I started skeptical science in 2007, and I came into it with a physical science background. So I had that kind of naive understanding that just explaining the facts should be enough to A, get people on board with climate change, and B, debunk climate misinformation. And it wasn't until a couple of years in that I received an email from a cognitive scientist from the University of Western Australia sending me psychological research into debunking, how to debunk effectively versus how to debunk ineffectively. And that really opened my eyes to the science of science communication, which I largely wasn't aware of. And it turned out to be a life-changing email because it dragged me into social science. I did a PhD in cognitive psychology and then started the process of transforming skeptical science into still debunking misinformation about climate change, but consistently with the best practices from the psychology research.
And Ben, obviously, that is something you've known from the beginning of your your journey into your career, given that your area has always been all about the psychology of this and change and how people's brains work. Why, if anyone's wondering, are facts of the physical science not enough?
Well, yeah, so, as you say, my background is in experimental psychology and cognitive psychology. So thinking about and examining and understanding and researching how people think, how people learn, how people decide, how people judge. And as Alvin was pointing out, I kind of got into merging that knowledge with thinking about climate communication when I was working with Professor Andy Pittman, who's the director of CLEX. And it was a bit like with John, it was a kind of a life-changing or illuminating moment, because I'd been thinking, okay, I've done all this work, thinking about risk perception and choice and framing, and surely there should be a way of using that and applying it to the climate debate and the climate discussions. And so working on that paper with Andy and getting to talk to other climate scientists who was expressing their frustration really at saying, well, we know what's happening, we can see what's happening, we keep telling people what's happening, but no one listens to us, or they don't understand, or how can we improve? And I'm not a communications researcher, I'm not a science communication expert, and so there's still and that's where people like Alvin come in, because they can take the kinds of basic science that I've been doing and that I'm interested in doing, and think more directly about, okay, here's a comms problem that we face. How can some of these techniques come to use it? And to go to the nub of your question, why can't you just tell people the facts or explain them in more simple ways? I think it's because people are, this is why psychology is such an interesting discipline. People are infinitely complex, and people are very different, and people respond to different types of information. So some sectors, some people do respond to the facts, and that is enough to get them on board. Some people are on board with these issues even if they don't understand the facts, because they have some emotional reaction, they see some personal experience that's enough to sort of move the dial for them to think, yeah, this is an important issue, I need to do something about it, even though they have zero real grasp of the chemistry, if you like, or the physics of climate change. So you have to try and adapt your messaging, or think about your communication as targeting all of those different sectors of the community. And then you have the added challenge, which I'm sure we'll get to, of combating the misinformation that's out there as well. So even if people are engaged and want to figure out what's going on, it's not like there's a simple, easy source that you can go to and find out.
Yeah, and I suppose just as we can take advantage of different elements of people that will draw them to believe and understand what we believe and understand, there are also others like the fossil fuel industry who can also use similar tools. John, you mentioned where we've spoken before about the change in where the conversation's at. And we've talked about science communication, but it's not just about science, is it?
No, as Ben mentioned, like even if we get our science communication honed and fine-tuned and working really well, all that effort can be undone by misinformation. And when the public are presented with conflicting information, accurate information and misinformation, and they have no way to resolve the conflict between the two, they can cancel each other out and all our efforts can be undone. So it is really important that if we're in the business of communicating the science to the public, trying to raise science literacy, get people more accurately informed, we do have to address the problem of misinformation. Otherwise, we leave the public vulnerable to being misinformed, and our facts, our science that we're trying to communicate, vulnerable to being undermined. So yeah, my research is focused on understanding where misinformation is at, getting a read on the landscape and what's out there and how is it changing, and then developing solutions to it. And how it's changing is really interesting. We've used machine learning to build a 20-year history of misinformation, and we find that over that 20 years, there's been a gradual transition from climate science misinformation towards misinformation targeting climate solutions. So it's almost like a strategic retreat. As science denial becomes more and more untenable, there's more and more misinformation casting doubt on the solutions to climate change, whether it's attacking climate policy or attacking renewable energy. But the point of all of this misinformation, whether it's science misinformation or solutions misinformation, is to delay climate solutions. So coming up with solutions to solutions misinformation is important.
Yeah,
and I guess, Alvin, you're someone who's worked on, with science organisations through the Centres of Excellence. Have you observed that as a practitioner?
Yeah, I have actually, and I notice it in terms of how science stories are being reported. So around climate science, I'm actually seeing a decline in the reporting of the science, but I'm seeing an increase in the reporting of action. And I find it really interesting that this goes to the playbook that is being used by fossil fuel companies and cement industry, which is also another large carbon emitter, is very similar to the playbook that we saw with smoking when that was going. And I think Naomi Oreskes' Merchants of Doubt is a book that really covers this beautifully. But it also kind of touches on an area where the way that you get change is through finding the language of the people who you want to change. And it's about this idea of trust. So if I was to go and speak to an industry body, I need to speak in the language of industry about risk, about what's going to happen to them. And there's some very interesting research that's just come out of CLEX that looks at exactly that. How good is the science at giving people who work in business a decent understanding of risk? But if we were to go there as scientists and talk in a scientific language to business, they would ignore us. But if we go and we speak in the language of business, then they will pay attention to us. And I think that's a really, really important factor that we need to get our heads around. I hear it so often that, and it goes to this idea that you just give them the facts and they will change. It's not so much that, it's what's their voice. Another great practitioner in this space is Catherine Hayhoe, who is a scientist who works in the Christian areas of the US. And she goes out being a Christian herself, speaks in their language, and that's where she enacts change. There are professionals I know within Australia climate community who have literally changed the way they look and the way they speak so that they can talk to certain sectors and have them actually pay attention to them. If I'm a scientist and I walk out in a t-shirt and thongs, no one in business is going to listen to me. But if I walk out and I've got a suit and a tie and I'm speaking the language that they read in the Australian Financial Review, or there's someone I know who has influence in that sector, then they'll listen to me. And this is a kind of a crucial part that goes back to the fact, what we were talking about before, it's not just about facts. You actually have to find ways of reaching that audience and hitting their ideology and their emotions and the other things that drive them. So for me, that's been a really key part of being a practitioner. It's
not just about the message either, it's about the messenger.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so Ben, you've been looking into individual action. I know that there's always a lot of tension around this, whether individual action's not what we need system change. You can stop having plastic straws as much as you like, but there are bigger problems. Is it as simple as that? And what would you say to anyone who's got a strong opinion on individual action? What have you found?
Yeah, so the work that you're referring to is some work that I've done recently with a philosopher, actually, who's also at UNSW, Professor Jeremy Moss. And he is, his expertise is kind of in moral philosophy and in climate justice. And the point of our paper was to try and discuss the kind of moral arguments for taking action on climate change and how you might be able to merge some of those moral arguments with techniques like from behavioral science that promote people's willingness to take action or make it easier for them to take action. So there's been lots and lots of work done over the last decade or so in an area that's sort of collectively being talked about as nudging. So where you create settings for people's choices to be easier for them, so they don't really have to think too much about them. You make the paper straw the default rather than having to ask for it and push the plastic straw back. So anything that can create that making the environmental choice the easy choice should be a good thing. But on top of that, one of the limitations or the impediments that you get of people saying, well, it's just not going to make any difference, my action, whether I have the plastic straw or the paper straw, it's just me, it doesn't really matter. So what we tried to do was think about the moral arguments that you could put forward for why actually your individual action does matter. And they revolve around fairly classic ideas within moral philosophy, things like positive duty arguments. So if you can take an action that's going to help someone else, then you should do so. Negative duty type arguments, if you can take an action to stop harming someone, then you should do so. It may benefit you to dump your toxic waste on someone else's land, but it's the wrong thing to do. It's a harmful action. You know it's harmful, and therefore you shouldn't do it. And then the other one that we consider is this notion of a fair share. So how do you work out what is your fair share as an individual? And I think where the tension arises, and I don't have an answer to this, is yes, you can emphasize, and this is what we talk about in the paper, you can emphasize that if you collect, you aggregate each individual's action at scale, then that can have a significant impact. Or you point out that each of your actions taken over time, accumulating across time, can also have an impact. But there's still tension about what that action should be. So should it be taking a shorter shower or not, refusing the straw, or should it be lobbying your MP or signing petitions or going on rallies or all of these kinds of things and carrying on perhaps your relatively high emitting life just as normal, but doing those political actions. And I don't think there's a simple answer to that. There's obviously the sort of hypocrisy tension that can arise if I'm emailing my MP one day and then racing around in my huge gas guzzling car for the rest of the week. Then it doesn't sit right with people, but perhaps that's not the issue. It's not whether it sits right, it's what's going to be most effective.
And on the other hand, pointing out hypocrisy is very easy, and it can be employed as a tactic to dismiss anyone trying to bring about change. Does this relate at all to what you've found when it comes to the delaying or the misinformation about solutions and delay that we're seeing, John?
Yeah, there's two aspects of climate misinformation that's relevant to this. The first is really a kind of red herring or distraction form of misinformation, which is blaming climate change on individuals in order to delay making those systemic changes. Because even if every individual lived a perfect low carbon footprint life, that will only get us a small way towards actually transitioning our society to zero emissions. We need to transition from fossil fuel energy to renewable energies. By just focusing on what we as individuals can do, that can only get us a tiny part of the way towards that end destination. And the big irony is that one of the champions of this narrative have been fossil fuel companies who have funded carbon footprint calculators to get people focusing on individual solutions rather than collective action. So I would characterize that as a form of misinformation, which is distracting people from what really is where the bulk of the action needs to happen. And they've done it in order to delay that transition so that they can continue selling their product and making profits. The other form of misinformation relevant to this is, I think it was mentioned earlier by Alvin or Ben, the hypocrisy. Well, I wouldn't say it's misinformation so much, but it's accusing climate scientists of hypocrisy because they, for example, they would fly to a climate science conference, or activists going to a climate action conference is a way to cast doubt on climate action and erode support for climate science or climate action in general. And so that is another way of using the hypocrisy angle to try to slow down climate action. And that has been an increasingly common piece of misinformation. We've been looking at Twitter. What are the most viral tweets about climate change lately? And they tend to be these cultural war type tweets that othering people working in climate action, whether it's politicians or activists like Greta Thunberg, and accusing people who care about climate action of hypocrisy as a way of casting doubt on the whole climate movement.
Yeah, because I guess at the end of the day, you have to come down on, okay, so if you're saying that it's bad that this person who cares about climate is flying, are you saying that we all, including you, should stop flying? And it doesn't really get us anywhere. So I suppose with Ben, you're talking about, you know, this moral argument for us as individuals reflecting on our lives and what we do and don't do. And then as practitioners and in communication, we've also got to figure out what that means in terms of how we talk to people, because we don't want people to go away feeling that they are individually blamed or shamed because they're not making the most moral judgment. But we also do want to encourage individual action because it does do something, and it's often framed as something that does nothing. But we also don't want to encourage that so much that we're ignoring the responsibility that lies with corporations like fossil fuel companies. I just want to throw to you, Alvin, at this point, when you're reading and listening to all of this, how have you seen this play out in terms of climate communication as a practitioner? Are we aware enough as climate communicators of these issues?
I think one of the things that tends to happen, and it's really interesting talking about Twitter and what seems to be almost a culture wars type of thing. When I've been across all the three areas that I've been across, we tend to have a habit as climate communicators, particularly if we're advocating for a position, to make it a very black and white area. And our job as communicators broadly, not just climate communicators, but as a communicator, first principles, we're all about change and how do we make change. And one of the ways that we don't make change, except with an enormous amount of effort, but it often makes us feel good, is creating a black and white and choosing your allies and your enemies. And we do that a lot, particularly as advocates and advocacy bodies. And yet when you look at successful activities, for whatever it might be, it's never an individual, and it's often multiple voices coming together that didn't normally come together. And so the path to real change is to reach out across groups. So when we were talking before about having the voice to speak to different industry groups and all the rest of it, when you do that and you go into those industries, or you go to agriculture, or you go to wherever it might be, and you have multiple voices coming together, that tends to be when we see successful change. And what's happened with Adani has been a beautiful example of that, because it wasn't just the Greens, it was also the farmers, and then it became a whole lot of other people who are working in that field. And as a result, while Adani has approval to go ahead, it can't get funding, because there's been a lot of emphasis on the social consequences, and that also reflects on those businesses as well. So I guess where I'm going with this is this idea of multiple voices, getting rid of that oppositional approach to climate change and climate change action is the way that we will probably get things moving. And we're seeing it now in business. While our politicians in Australia may be very slow and resistant to action, business is moving because it sees it has a reason to. And the floods that we've just seen in Europe, currently in China, and the heat wave that we saw as well across Canada, these are all the types of things that are reminding people that climate change is happening. So now we move on to the next phase. Now we come to the resistance. And just one other thing very quickly, kind of tangentially, is I think John's work on inoculation theory, where you show people how they're being fooled, is very powerful in this space, because once you show someone how they've been fooled with a graph or whatever it might be through whatever venue, whether it's cherry picking, and they can see how that works, that goes into trust as well. And trust is another key component of whether you get to change people's minds. If someone can recognize someone is trying to fool them, then they won't trust that source anymore. And that's another way that we can move forward, by showing what people are trying to do to fool people, rather than saying, you're right, I'm wrong, and having these black and white slanging matches. So I've gone on a bit of a tangent there, but I think it touches on a lot of the things that we've talked about.
Yeah, so John, I might get you to talk about inoculation for misinformation, because the idea is that people will see how they're potentially fooled, and then they won't be fooled. But it goes beyond that, doesn't it? To they might be able to inoculate others, or teach them what they then know.
Yeah, I during my PhD, I ran some experiments seeing if you could prime people so that they were more resilient and less likely to be influenced by misinformation. And I was actually presenting my research at UNSW in Ben's building, I think it was. Ben was probably in the room. There was a professor in the front row who said, "What you're doing sounds a lot like inoculation," which I hadn't heard of. So it turns out researchers have been studying this for over half a century. But what inoculation finds is, by exposing people to a weakened form of misinformation, that builds up their immunity so that they're less likely to be misled, influenced by the actual misinformation in the same way as vaccination. And I've been studying that ever since, and researching how can you more effectively expose people to a weakened form of misinformation. In other words, explain those techniques used to mislead. And the benefit of this approach is that it depolarizes misinformation, or it neutralizes polarizing misinformation, which is really important when you have a polarized issue like climate change. And B, it works across topics. You can inoculate people against a technique of misinformation in one topic, for example, tobacco misinformation, and conveys immunity against the same technique in climate misinformation. And so it's kind of like a universal vaccine against misinformation, giving people critical thinking to assess misinformation, not just in climate change, but in vaccination misinformation or COVID misinformation or anything.
Although you might not want to tell them you're inoculating them against misinformation if you are targeting them to be to move further away from their vaccine hesitancy.
Well, at least there's no needles involved. Although there was one funny thing was we, like you mentioned, the game, we have an inoculating game, and we encountered our first form of an adverse reaction to it. We were deployed, like we were having the game in a where was it? It was in Ohio in the US, and we had a few people react badly to it. One was people who believed in homeopathy, because there were a few examples in the game that debunked arguments of homeopathy, and they said as soon as they saw that, they stopped the game, they stopped playing. And then there were some political conservatives who saw some elements that were debunking popular conservative talking points. And it was only after a while reflecting on this that I realized it's almost like the AstraZeneca adverse reaction, but but from a psychological inoculation point of view.
These people had a pre-existing condition of, being into these other things that you were hoping they weren't. So that would have made it, a lot harder to inoculate them. That's so interesting. And when it comes to as communicators, sometimes people say, oh, they're preaching to the choir and things like that, but sometimes also we're communicating to potential communicators. Like with this show, I know it's called Climate Australia, so anyone who's not really into talking about or thinking about climate problems and solutions is not going to be listening and watching, but that's why we're talking about climate communication, because those who are potentially going to be learning about how they can better use some different techniques to communicate, and hopefully they'll be able to help people feel better about their individual action, or at least less bad about other people not doing enough. So Ben, when you are listening to, as someone in the field, and you've listened to, John's examples of using these different skeptical science and the game and things like that. But you've obviously come at this topic of individual action from more of a philosophical point. What is kind of the next step? Because I think the other day when the four of us caught up, I reflected that often there's a gap between practitioners in communication and researchers in, things that can inform communication, which is ironic given what we do. Are there things that people who are practitioners watching might be able to do to get better informed on the areas of research that you're across?
I think one thing is just creating awareness that there is a huge amount of information out there looking at these kinds of items. So, for example, the journal Nature Climate Change, which focuses on climate change science, but also publishes things on communication, risk perception, willingness, understanding of arguments. So it's an active area of research that if people, communicators, want to delve into it and find out about it, then I think there's important findings in there. And I think the other point that came to mind, not just on the individual sort of action stuff, but when John was talking, is we've talked about how just giving people the facts is probably not going to be enough. It's not enough for everyone. But there's also that important point, and this comes to the sort of generalization issue. So I'm interested in how people make decisions, how people reason and judge generically, right, across the board. What are the fundamental cognitive processes underlying these kinds of things? And that brings you really to think about when people are reasoning about these problems, what kind of information, or just the order of information that you present people how does that really change their perception? So for example, an interesting study that we talk about in the paper I mentioned, not our work, but work from Carnegie Mellon in the US, just presented people with information about a carbon tax, and they also presented them information about a sort of default option for renewable energy. And what they were interested in was what was people's support for the carbon tax versus the renewable energy, depending on the order in which they found out about that information in the experiment. And what they found was I think really interesting, was that if they were presented with the information about the tax first, then they found about 60% of their respondents said, yeah, this is a good idea, we should do it. But if they found out information about the default electricity plan, that they could go on a renewables electricity plan, then support for the tax, if they found out about that first, support for the tax dropped to about 40%. And one explanation for that is that if people think, oh, well, I'm doing my fair share, I'm doing my bit because I'm in this renewable energy plan, so I don't really need to put up the support for this tax. Just because of the order of reasoning that they went through when they were presented with that information. And yet, of course, the tax is a far more efficient, far more effective measure. And just because I'm getting my electricity from a green source, that's great for me. And if we all did it, and if the demand was all there across the board, and no one paid for electricity unless it was green, then fine. But as John was pointing out, we're not going to get there that way. And so from a communication point of view, it's really important that order in which you present those arguments and the way people reason through those arguments can have a big impact on the perception of efficacy. So it's little things like that, but there's a huge amount of them, and distilling them and getting them out into the public, but via these people who specialize in the communications is really important.
And it's another great example of why these lessons aren't important only to those of us who call ourselves communicators, but to politicians, because, sometimes you see things that people who are experts in the field will tell you is the best policy for X, but it doesn't rate well, and it doesn't get up for political reasons. And
absolutely,
the carbon tax obviously in Australia is so politicized that we can't even talk about going in the direction of implementing something like that unless there's a total rebrand and PR around that. It looks completely different. So it strikes me again with the pandemic right now that so many, as communicators and practitioners, you're often chasing you're seeing a press release and you're seeing a politician word something in some way because they've received some health advice, and then you're potentially having to go, okay, now that's the way it's been initially and most broadly communicated. We're going to try and communicate it differently, rather than having a more conscious way of doing that up front as politicians.
Absolutely, and I think that goes to some of the work that John's been involved in as well, about to do with the way you hear the information first, and how sticky that can be, and how difficult it is then to sow the seed of the retraction of that information or the update to that information.
We found that order matters as well in terms of facts and misinformation. We found that if you, in one experiment, we either showed people a factual explanation about climate change and then some misinformation, or we switched the order. So they saw the misinformation first and then the factual explanation. We found that if the misinformation was the last thing that people saw, it cancelled out the factual explanation, and there was no positive effect from the facts. But if the facts were the last thing that people saw, then there was a positive effect. So order matters, and there's this recency effect. The most recent thing you see has the biggest influence. But the interesting thing in that experiment was we also tested a logical explanation of the misinformation, like explaining the logical fallacy in the misinformation. And we found in that case, order didn't matter. whether the logical correction was a debunking or a pre-bunking, it was equally effective in countering the misinformation. So it's not an easy kind of picture we're painting here. Facts, order matters, logic, it's more robust, but it's complicated.
Yeah, and I suppose there's completely new things you're hearing for the first time with no context versus you coming in with a decade of hearing your social circles talk about a certain issue in a certain way. Complex, but still good to know that there is research out there, and then as practitioners, knowing our contexts and audiences, hopefully the best, because we're more, at that coalface, if you want to use that term. Hopefully we'll be able to apply that in our own scenario. Sorry, Ben, did you want to?
I was just going to say, I was just going to say, and I think that's what the approach is that John and I take in thinking of this from a behavioural science sort of perspective, is that yes, the experiments that we run are somewhat constrained and artificial, but in another way that's a deliberate tactic and a deliberate way of being able to disentangle the influences of things like order, or like the type of misinformation that you give people, or arguments about moral duties, because it's only in those sort of more tightly controlled settings that you can distill out, well, what is having the causal influence here. And that's the kind of information that then hopefully can feed forward into campaigns, whether it's about climate change or vaccination, which I was speaking about before I came onto this call. It's important to get that out there.
Yeah, and I think as well, even though we might think the horse is bolted on climate change and we can't present anything new to people without them having a context, there's always so much when it comes to the potential for different solutions. And obviously, as John's spoken about, and we've all seen that we've moved from the science being what's being debated over to the solutions and the potential for this time frame, or what is even going to work and things like that. And it becomes about delay of action rather than denial. So there's always new scenarios we can put these learnings into, whether it's about climate change or whether it's about other things that impact the public. So hopefully anyone who's listening or watching, whether you're watching live right now, we are on Facebook and YouTube and here on Simpatico TV, but we will be podcasting this out after the fact, and it will be there for people to watch back and learn from as time goes on. And of course, the other person I should do a shout out to, if anyone's watching and is interested in learning more about climate communication, I was talking about that in previous episodes with both practitioners and researchers as well. And of course, the book behind me is How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference, which gets cited a lot. So if you want to see that previous episode with Rebecca Huntley, definitely check that out as well. I've taken up all of our time. I've had so much fun learning about this more as a practitioner. It's always great to learn and about more things that we can implement in our work. So thank you, John and Ben, for bringing Alvin and I some of your research. And Alvin, thank you for bringing us your experience as a practitioner in implementing this into your practice.
Our pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Appreciate it.
And of course, we'll be back again with another episode of Climate Australia. We'll be doing an episode with the Centre of Excellence for Climate Extremes every month, so look out for that next month. And thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.